What if your neighborhood became unrecognizable? Across the world, cities are transforming. Some changes bring hope, some spark resistance, and others a bittersweet mix of both. For neighborhoods like Hull in Gatineau, Quebec, change isn't just about a new high-rise or a cafe. It's a transformation of identity, a reimagining of who belongs. The island of Hull stands at a crossroads, caught between the echoes of its past and the pull of an uncertain future. But this story isn't only about the streets and storefronts. It's about the lives here, the families and histories that have defined Hull's character for generations. But before we look at Hull, we need to understand what this global phenomenon called gentrification is. It all started in 1964, where sociologist Ruth Glass coined the term gentrification to describe a quiet revolution that was taking place in London's working-class neighborhoods. You see, wealthier families moved in, rents began to rise, and soon the communities that have thrived for generations were being transformed. For some, it looked like progress, but for many, it felt like loss. And we've seen this time and time again. You see, gentrification typically starts when wealthier families or investors begin moving into lower-income neighborhoods. At first, this may bring a new fresh air. You see, it brings new businesses, improved infrastructure, and rising property values. For some, this all looks like progress, but soon the cost of living in these areas begins to increase, often beyond what long-standing residents can afford. Rents go up and familiar faces begin to disappear. It gets replaced by new shops, cafes, and condos catering to a different crowd. At its core, gentrification reflects the power dynamics of urban spaces. Those with more resources can influence neighborhoods to suit their needs, while those without may find themselves priced out, often nowhere else to go. The change brings benefits, sure, safer streets, fresh investments, a new energy, but for many it feels like a loss. The unique culture and history of the neighborhood, the spirit that made it special, can be eroded as gentrification takes hold. Gentrification isn't just a city planning trend, it's a social and cultural shift with real consequences. For longtime residents, it means more than rising rents. It's about losing the spaces where they felt they belonged. And today, gentrification isn't just a London phenomenon. It's a global force that touches neighborhoods from Brooklyn to Berlin, from Barcelona to our quiet little Hull in the National Capital Region. Each neighborhood, once rich with culture and community, is reshaped by the forces of wealth and development. But what is lost in the process, and what does it mean for the people who built their lives here? But to truly understand Hull and its story, we have to look back to its early days, when this area was already bustling, long before Ottawa even existed. You see, founded in 1800 by Philemon Wright, an American entrepreneur, Hull is actually the oldest European settlement in what would later become Canada's National Capital Region. Wright saw potential in the Ottawa River's vast untapped forest land and envisioned Hull as a timber-producing powerhouse. And this vision would attract a wave of French Canadians and Irish immigrants who saw Hull an opportunity to build new lives, raise families, and create communities. Throughout the 19th century, Hull's timber and paper mills became the backbone of the region's economy. The work was hard, dangerous, and physically demanding, but it provided a lifeline for workers who had come here in search of stability. For many, Hull was more than just a job site. It was a tight-knit community that thrived along the river banks, bound together by a shared resilience and a determination to carve out a home in a rugged landscape. By the mid-1800s, Hull was growing into a prosperous industrial center. Ottawa was just still a small lumber town across the river. It wasn't until 1857 when Queen Victoria chose Ottawa as Canada's capital. Believe it or not, but it's only at that time that Ottawa began to outshine its older, industrious neighbor. And while Ottawa evolved into the political heart of Canada, Hull retained its role as the hard-working industrial counterpart, a distinction that shaped the region's unique character. But you see, as Hull was developing, it also faced its share of challenges. Major fires in 1888 and 1900 devastated much of the city, including entire neighborhoods and major industrial sites, but each time Hull rebuilt, driven by the spirit of its people. And this resilience becomes a defining feature of Hull's identity, setting it apart as a place of enduring strength and community bonds. And looking at Hull's architecture, it isn't just a backdrop, it's a tangible memory of the lives and stories that defined this community. For those who live here, these aren't just buildings, they're reminders of a shared history, symbols of resilience and connection. And this connection would be tested in major ways. You see, in the 1960s, Hull faced its first wave of displacement, not through gentrification, but through expropriation. You see, the Mécano-Laramie sector was cleared, displacing hundreds of families and uprooting businesses. Entire communities were dismantled in the name of development. And for those affected, it wasn't just a loss of property, but a loss of belonging, a fracture of their identity. Another wave of expropriation would happen when Hull was chosen as a site for this federal expansion intended to balance the government presence on both sides of the Ottawa River. This plan aimed to transform Hull from an industrial town to a vital component of Canada's federal landscape. It would be completed with modern office buildings to house thousands of civil servants. In theory, it promised economic opportunities and jobs, but for the people of Hull, it came at a tremendous personal cost. Families who had lived in these neighborhoods for generations found themselves suddenly uprooted. The expropriation cleared out vibrant residential areas and small businesses that served the local community. For many, the process was abrupt and unsettling. The land that once held tightly knit communities, schools, churches, and local shops was now repurposed to meet federal needs, erasing the familiar spaces that gave Hull its identity. Those affected weren't merely losing property, they were losing the neighborhoods they'd grown up in, the network of friends and family, and the places that held generations of memories. For Hull, those expropriation left a lasting scar, a reminder of how quickly a community can disappear when growth is prioritized over people. And for many, it's a painful lesson that progress isn't always synonymous with prosperity. Today, Hull is experiencing another transformation, but this time, it's not just bulldozers that are reshaping the neighborhood. It's the invisible hand of the market. Rising property values driven by outside investors are making it harder for longtime residents to stay in the neighborhoods they've called home for generations. To many, the promise of progress feels more like erasure. Gentrification is often marketed as progress, a way to revitalize a neighborhood. But for Hull's residents, it feels like a slow push out. Rising rents and new developments create a divide between old and new, drawing in wealthier newcomers unaware of the sacrifices others are making. You see, gentrification isn't just about buildings, it's about the people and the relationships that define a community. For Hull's longtime residents, the rising costs aren't just numbers, they're a loss of place, a loss of identity. And gentrification doesn't affect everyone equally. You see, Ile-de-Hull is a low-income area, and for Hull's low-income families, seniors, and immigrant communities, the rising costs are not just a financial burden, they're a threat to their way of life. Studies have shown that affordable housing options are declining, and it makes it harder for those with deep ties to Hull to find new places to live within that neighborhood. And for those who remain, the changes often feel foreign. The faces, the stores, and even the familiar places that once made Hull feel like home are disappearing, and they're getting replaced by spaces that feel like they belong somewhere else. And for Hull's longtime residents, this shift is more than just a loss of community. It's a displacement of memory, identity, and belonging. Hull's story is one of resilience, a community that has endured waves of change and has adapted. But as gentrification reshapes Hull once again, its future hangs in the balance. Can Hull find a way to grow without losing its soul? Can it welcome new faces without pushing out those who made it what it is? Hull's identity isn't just in its buildings or street. It's in its people, its culture, its history, and the decisions made today will reshape Hull's story for generations. And the question remains, whose story will Hull tell?